Welcome to Programmable World, a podcast all about tech ventures, the stories behind them, and the wisdom gleaned from lessons learned. My name is Dan Ilett. I'm an ex-tech journalist, and today I help tech companies to go to market, raise their commercial value, and win more business. I've worked with some of the biggest brands in the world on storytelling, brand, launches, and sales, having launched a few of my own tech companies as well. I love hearing people's stories about how they contributed to their ventures and what they learned on the way. Whether you're an entrepreneur, a business leader, or interested in technology, Programmable World will ignite some sparks and get you thinking about what's possible. I am joined today by my good friend, Tomás O'Leary. Tomás is the CEO and founder of Origina, an incredible company that's taking on IBM, and is one of those really great David and Goliath stories that's emerging in the tech market right now. He's going to talk a bit more about that in a second. But first of all, we're going to hear all about Tomás's sore shoulder. What's going on, Tomás? How are you today?
I've got pain going down my right arm. I understand it's old age, Dan, and I'm just very disappointed by it. My doctor did tell me when I turned 50 a couple of years ago, he said, by the way, you're now in Sniper Alley. So be ready for problems. So to be fair, a sore shoulder, maybe it's not the worst thing that can happen to you, as long as there's nothing going on inside my shoulder that I don't know about. So
I mean, you stay pretty fit, right? You do quite a lot of working out and stuff. You always look pretty trim. What's going on there?
Listen, thank you, Dan. It's all relative. Maybe just a bit of yoga, a bit of tennis, a bit of cycling, and the odd kind of raising of the glass after a Six Nations weekend. So, but I won't rub that in because you guys had a tricky day in Twickenham, even though you should have won that game. No question. Should have won that game, hands down.
I was actually at the match. I was there and I had a table of guests. And of course, there was my business partner, the only Scot. I was introducing David as Scottish David, thinking we would absolutely trounce them. And of course they won. So fair play to them. It was good. Scotland did brilliantly.
They did, but I think England threw it away. They didn't tackle.
No, I'm not. I don't want to talk about England. It's a sore point at the moment. Right?
Okay. But that's my sore shoulder. Yeah. So hopefully it won't interfere with the podcast here today. So
no, let's hope there's no sound interference from the shoulder. So we've known each other for 12 or 13 years, I guess. And I first met you. You'd just come to London and you were looking for introductions for a new business you were starting then. I guess the first question is for everyone who's listening to this, what is it you do?
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, we know each other. I think 2011 when I first came over, one of the first people I was introduced to as was starting my journey. Yeah, I run a business based in Dublin here in Ireland, but I spend most of my time all around the world. And our business helps large companies, principally those we talk about Fortune 1000 from the year 2000. So big companies with a lot of technical debt, specifically IBM software debt. And we help them use that technology for longer, save significant amount of money, and get a better value out of it. That's simply what we do. But we are what an economist would describe as the independent aftermarket. So we compete directly with IBM, who wrote the software, and we come along and say, well, actually, they've given you the perpetual right to use that software. You don't need to keep spending any more money with them. You can decide to spend no money with them and keep using the software, or you can use someone like us. We're an independent aftermarket, the same way you might do with your car after a while.
Yeah, so let's break this down. So, the same way you might have a car and, traditionally like BMW, Audi, all the big car manufacturers, they want you to go to them for the service. And you sort of felt like you were obliged to do that. Now, you don't have to do that. You can go anywhere for the service, right?
Yeah.
And in the same way with mainframes are these huge old computers that big organizations still use, if you don't know what they are. Massive old things that, there aren't many people around who can operate them anymore, but people still use them because they don't want to get rid of them because they're worried about the risk of moving away from them because they're so dependent on them. And so what you're saying is traditionally, IBM and the likes of would force you to run your servicing through them, and the contract had to go through them, so they could charge you what they wanted to. Is that right?
Yeah, it's not just IBM, to be honest with you. It's Microsoft, every software company in the world. So it doesn't even have to be mainframes. But yeah, I mean, that's been the way it has been for a long time since software was written, because when software was first written, it didn't work. So you kind of needed the guy who wrote the software to fix all the bugs. Now we're 30, 40 years later, the bugs are all fixed. I must correct you, the mainframes actually aren't that old. The physical machines we don't support those. But the physical machines are actually quite new in many cases because they keep rolling them out. IBM sells many of these every year and replaces the old ones with new ones. The software probably was written many years ago. That's the thing. The software could have been written 25, 30 or more years ago. Very stable. Bizarrely, this stable software that is written 25, 30 years ago ends up costing you more money every year. And you can't get the skills anymore. And they keep make changes to it that you didn't want to make to it. So there's a demand for big corporations who are trying to do digital transformation. They're trying to do, all these things that companies are trying to do out there with technology. They don't want to be dragged back down into the depths of, where Scotty hangs out, in the engine room and constantly having to make massive changes down there. They want this stuff to run. They want this to carry on. So, there's space for a company like us. And there's aftermarkets in every single, independent aftermarkets in every industry. So it was just a matter of time when it came out in the software space. That's all. And that's all we are. We're one of a handful of players in that space.
It is a really interesting space. So that's the space you're playing in. What is it that gave you the idea for doing this?
In simple terms, in 2009, I read an article from a London-based investment company commenting on, wasn't even IBM. We were a partner of IBM's at the time here in Ireland and somewhat in the UK and across Europe. We were kind of a company that partnered with IBM and other technology firms. We kind of would be a niche boutique SI is what we were. Very small. And I was reading this article about SAP and Oracle and their stock price. This is 2009. Now, the investment piece got it all wrong in terms of don't invest in them because they've continued to soar. But the point it was making was there was lines of business that these companies had, which was software maintenance, which represented significant portions of their revenue. And that was outrageously profitable in the high 90% profitability. And the argument was that was unsustainable. So that was the trigger for, I guess, the idea, this must also be the case with every other software company. And we were a partner of IBM's. And then we looked at some of the business we did with IBM and on behalf of IBM with customers of ours. And we were selling them these maintenance contracts that the customers never even used. They saw it as an insurance policy for software that didn't break. And every now and again, we benefited as a provider of the IBM ecosystem every time the customer had to make those upgrades, that they may or may not have needed. So I kind of looked at all this and I describe myself as a healthy skeptic. So I've always looked at things and said, don't really, unless I really, but I question everything. So I was questioning this stuff, even though I was in the middle of doing it, I was going, this is all wrong. And I wasn't 100% comfortable where I was personally in my business because I felt that I was just riding on the coattails of somebody else. So I always had a desire to do my own thing. I always had a desire, you mentioned the David versus Goliath. I always had a desire to have a go and tried to do something different. So that's what I did. I flew to London and I didn't know anybody and I met you.
So picking up from there, when I met you, you told a great story of we're really successful here. We're doing brilliant things here. And, and I think everyone kind of went, wow, this guy's really impressive. He's got an incredible business. He's going to do good things. But at that point, you've since told me you didn't quite know where it was going to go and you weren't quite where you said you might have been, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think every entrepreneur has to fake it till they make it. Yeah, listen, what can you do? You have to be one page ahead if you can be, or at least preferably one chapter ahead in the book. So yeah, you kind of spot the opportunity. I mean, clearly at the end of the day, when you start to do business, you have to have follow through and it has to be real. Okay. So
yeah, of course, but you were still writing the script at that point, right? For what you were going to be doing. Because I think the proposition wasn't clear at that point, right?
No. And I had another business in Ireland at the time, the one so we had a business that was partnered with IBM. And then what happened in 2011, we got the IBM terminated our contract. So I had to re-engineer that business. So I managed to salvage something out of that business and it became more of just a technical services company. Actually was fixing computers in data centers. So hardware, we were doing what's called hardware third-party maintenance is what we did. I had business. I was doing business. What I did though, because I wanted to get into the software maintenance side and we weren't in it. The story I had to tell was what my mother would call a white lie. You know what a white lie is, Dan? It's not a serious lie. It's just a kind of slight exaggeration, okay, of the truth. And the slight exaggeration of the truth was that we were telling people, the market, that we were already doing what we were planning to do. Okay. And I didn't advertise the fact that the actual service was fixing computers. It had some software on it. So there was a gray area there, but it wasn't quite what we do now, which is pure 100% software maintenance. But you got to start somewhere. So you've got to start somewhere. I mean, ultimately, the buyers who bought from us, they did their due diligence. They knew what they were buying. So it wasn't that we were going around the place saying one thing and being totally sleight of hand.
No, not at all. No, it was more just you were writing the script as you were kind of going and meeting people, and sort of, you know, as any startup does, that script is pretty flexible when you're first testing out ideas, right? And I love that story. You know, I loved it when you told me that, because it made me feel more human.
Yeah, I mean,
I thought you had everything under control.
But like anything, there's a balance. It's like, how far do you push those stories? I mean, I wasn't taking in people's money and doing this. So this is my own, you know, meager amounts of money we had. So I wasn't taking a risk with anybody else's livelihood. So the only person I was taking a risk with was myself. So, and ultimately the type of companies we do business with, you can imagine they're not going to sign up with somebody like us unless they really know what they're signing up to. So we had to prove our credentials. But yeah.
We talk about something, you know, in my business, we talk about the credibility gap. And, you know, there's a lot of technology companies out there that are incredibly good. Their capability is amazing, but their credibility in the market, you know, because their engagement is poor, or they've never done any engagement, you know, they don't really have any customers, or they may have some customers that love them, but the market doesn't really see them as the same that the customers do, you know. They've got a credibility gap. So the question is, how do you fill the credibility gap? So the story is the way. And you've always been a really good storyteller. What is it then? You were sort of building the business, finding these sort of really big companies, which is no easy feat. You know, having done it myself, trying to get those conversations with CIOs and CXOs and then even win some of those contracts is really hard, especially in the UK, right? Where no one wants to talk to you about anything unless you can really solve a problem. To go from there, where are you now with the business, would you say?
We're on the growth trajectory. So when we started, that, you're right, those early wins were really tricky, but we were lucky insofar as early on, you talk about the credibility gap. To get credibility, what we had to do is go to the venues where the potential buyers were hanging out. So where do big companies go when they've got issues around software costs, software complexity? I'm talking about enterprise software across the board in these very large FTSE, 100 companies. They actually go to conferences. So I found out about these conferences, and at the same time I got involved, because I'm interested in this, I got involved in lobbying, setting up a lobby group in the European Commission in Brussels in 2014, got it up and running, but we were planning for it during 2012 and 2013. So I realized I had information that was quite interesting to this community. They wanted to know what level of interest were legislators taking in any of this at all. Okay. And I just knew one chapter or even one page more than they knew. And I used this as content and offered it to these conferences to go and be a speaker. And that's how I got my own credibility. So I came as the guy who was treasurer of this organization, which is still around, called Free ICT Europe. At the time, I was the treasurer. I'm now the president of it. So I used this as my calling card. I couldn't afford actually to be a sponsor at these conferences. So people were, other companies were paying fees to have a booth or even have a ticket. I couldn't even afford a ticket at the time. But I used my content as my entry fee and got access to the community. And that's how I found the early adopters. And what happened was I realized being a little bit controversial. So by calling out some of the sharp practices of the vendors, the likes of Oracle, SAP, IBM, Microsoft, the big enterprise software vendors, by calling out some of their sharp practices, I got a following. Now, to be honest with you, if there was 100 people in the room, and I was lucky if there was 100 people, but just use 100 for the purpose of the math, I knew immediately that I was going to alienate a significant portion of the room, because who were longtime advocates of the big vendor approach and would have been exposed to what I described their propaganda for many years. So I knew I was going to alienate those, but I wasn't after those. I was just after the 10 or 12 who actually liked my story, who actually felt, I don't like the fact that these big software vendors come to me and they dictate our technology roadmap. They decide, how much money we're paying. We don't even get a choice in some of this stuff. They decide how long these contracts are for. They decide when I make the next upgrade. I don't get to decide that. I don't get to decide any of that. And they were annoyed by this. They would be what you typically would call in the marketing world, the early adopters, those guys who wanted to jump in and they dragged me to the table quicker. They wanted to drag us into their companies. Now, some of them were so big agitators of the industry, and they ended up nearly making it difficult for us to sell because these are quite conservative companies we were trying to talk to initially. You can imagine, like banks and insurance companies and very large PLCs in the UK. So we nearly had to ask them to tone it down a small bit because, they were so passionate about practices. I mean, they saw what we had to offer and said, "Oh, you can really give them a good kick in the backside." We're like, "Well, yes, we can, but let's do this the right way." Yeah, it was interesting.
With these guys, you see this a lot now and I'm working on something myself. I'll tell you about it in a little while. But it certainly seems to be the case that companies buy what the analysts tell them to buy, not what they necessarily need to buy, because they're scared of buying something that's different. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's the problem, and that's been the norm. So trying to find those people who don't fall into that camp is what we became good at. We were good at finding those people and creating a mini community around those buyers. Well, they weren't buyers initially, but those people who had similar mindset, that they actually didn't want to believe what the analysts are saying, and they didn't want to believe everything that the vendors were telling them, and had seen or maybe had been burnt by something in the past and were annoyed and sufficiently annoyed to want to stand up and say something about it. And I just became a voice for them, which I kind of had an instinct that this would be the case, but I wasn't sure. So that goes back to what you said to me earlier. Why I was able to tell the story was the logic says there's got to be people out there. Not everybody will believe every story, and not everybody believes my story. Trust me, and you asked the original question was, where are we now? We've had to move beyond those early adopters because there's only so many of those out there. We've had to go more mainstream, as in we've had to go to the wider market and have a much more comprehensive offering and story that isn't just about, the agitation and annoyance of what the vendors are up to. It has to be more about actually we give a real service. It's secure. It's dependable. All those things that people want.
I mean, how many people are you employing at the moment?
So we have two types of groups. So if you take just the employees within an organization, approximately 150, 160 people. All right. But then all of the people, a bit like if you asked Uber how many people they employ, they also have then all the drivers, So then we have it's not quite Uber, but it's still a similar style model where the guys girls, mostly guys to be fair, but let's use guys as a kind of a general term for both male and female, if that's okay. They would be mostly 50, I think they're 52, average 53 or 54 in Europe, 55, 56 in the US. Ex-IBM consultants, specialists in the software. We had to build that type of model because the variety of software, even within the IBM portfolio, several thousand software products. And we had to then select those which we could do because of the license type. So which is the vast majority of the software, but not all software, because not all software is licensed perpetually, which means you can use it forever. And clearly, if you can't use it forever, well, then we can't really help you because if either a timeline or the minute we take over the service contract. So some are off page, but those people, we have several hundred of those what we call global IBM experts. And they're really the oil that makes their machine work.
I remember there was a sort of gear change for you guys, and it reflects what you were saying, about the story had to be more grown up and it had to look like a technology company that could service, mature, serious companies and actually be a proper player in the market, not just someone who was going after wild first early adopters. When that was going on, I noticed a couple of things that changed in you. You built a wider team around you of very good advisors. You focused the effort on America, which was a market you could go for instead of Europe, which it's very difficult to kind of penetrate. There's so many different things moving around. It's not the easiest and most accepting of new ideas all the time anyway, but like America, there's a market for that kind of thing. But the story you were starting to tell, although the essence of it was the same, you were starting to do it in a different way. Can you talk about the gear change? Because I think that's the really interesting part of this story and where it went from there.
Yeah, I think the gear change hinges, and I think you've touched on many critical parts of it. But the main one there was laser focus on the United States particularly, as the single biggest market for IBM software, which is our market we're after. We also do HCL, which is a company from India that IBM sold some of its software assets to. But it was that single focus on North America. And then understanding how do you do business there. So the advisor piece was a critical component to that, because the automatic assumption one might make from wherever you are in the world, whether it's the UK, France, Germany, or even Ireland, or even Australia, when you want to do business in the United States, you're not from there. You know, we all watch Hollywood movies and Netflix. We think we understand America. We don't. And actually, there's lots of different parts of America that are all different. I'm talking just even purely out of business context. I'm talking culturally or anything else. I'm just talking how to do business there. So the first big assumption you make is that I got to go move there. All right. That's a big decision to make. I've got a family back here in Ireland, you know, my children at school, and I didn't really want to up sticks, but, you know, but I thought about it. So I decided to seek advice rather than make assumptions based on what other people in Ireland or Europe do. What do Americans think? What do business people in America who are in the technology space? So I was really lucky to have a network already of people that knew people. So it's rarely the people you end up working with in your network are often not the people that are you're closest to. It's the people at the edge of their networks, your network's network, if you know what I mean. So it's, you know, when we met first, and it wasn't, I didn't know you, I knew Finlay McLeod, and you knew Finn as well. So we both knew at a single contact. I had known Finn because I'd worked with him as a supplier and got on well with him and respected him and saw him as a very wise and experienced person. So I reached out to him. But the people you end up engaging with are often at the edge. So I found some really, really experienced and wise tech entrepreneurs in the US who helped us understand what we needed to do to be credible in the US market. And we took that advice and we listened and acted upon it. And actually it was funny because these people, and two of them are on board. One of them was a guy called Phil Sauron and Jim Leslie, both on our board. But the other guys, Marty Sanders, who actually works for us now, and Dennis Johnson, these people would have been in the industry for a long, long time. They would have had very successful careers. And I'm talking about like Phil's, you know, sold company to Seagate back in the early 90s. Then he sets up a company, sells it to Dell, puts it on the New York Stock Exchange, sells it to Dell, then sets up a company with Jim Leslie and they sell it off to Microsoft. You know, so it's a different league. But they liked the story, which is great. But the reason they actually stayed with us so far is because actually, and we gave this feedback directly, we listened to the feedback and we acted upon, not all of it, because not all of it was relevant. We chose the bits that were important to us and we said, we'll take these and we'll do it, but we're not going to take those. But one of the first pieces of advice they gave me was, why would you want to move to America? And I'm going, well, I just assumed, well, you don't need to. Well, as long as you can get here and you've got a team here, you don't need to. So it's like, but that was just, it's a one small thing, but there was lots and lots of that advice. And that allowed us put the right focus, the right investment into US. And I think that is the piece that gave us that impetus to grow our business. And it's now, at the moment, it's 60% of the business we do globally.
Incredible. One of the other impressive sort of changes I noticed was when you guys figured out you could systemize the way to look at people's maintenance contracts, basically. You could look at the parts that they were using versus the contracts they'd got by looking at some of the data, you know, some of the information that was in there. And are we okay to talk about that? Is that all right?
Yeah, no, it is probably still the most exciting thing that we internally look at in terms of where we might be able to take the company and how we might be able to leverage. But yeah, so you're talking about our tool. We call it OLIS, the Irish word for knowledge. We use it internally as a way of, it's about creating a production line because this software is so complicated. And it's not complicated technically, by the way. It's complicated by the types of licenses. It's the paperwork that goes with software. I mean, I heard a story.
The legal work.
Yeah. It's like somebody told me recently that Microsoft apparently has they have more kind of lawyers, without actually lawyers, but could contract people and license people than they have technical people. Now, I don't know how true that is, but it wouldn't surprise me. It didn't surprise me because the amount of detail that's in those licensed. And this is what makes it really hard for companies. No matter how big an organization you are, no matter how many resources you have, the odds are stacked against you getting your head around this. So we haven't cracked it completely, but what we have cracked is for all of the IBM software that's out there, we've put together a tool that instead of making it to make it repeatable. So when we see some information, we capture it. And we capture whether it's about a license or a product or whatever the thing may be, we capture it in this tool. And we've been doing this since 2014 when we first built it. And it's a phenomenal tool now. It's like, and it's instantaneous and it's now building out our whole. So as soon as we talk to a company with IBM software, the first thing we need to know is what licenses they have before we can, because there's no point in moving any further. If all those licenses are in the cloud or have some restrictions, we need to know, and they need to know early on, because what's the point in having a further conversation? So now we're pretty confident that we could we know already, but we have to be sure. You have to be 100% sure. So we need to see the paperwork on what you have. And we do that all under NDA, and the customers share with us the paperwork, the licenses, and all that data gets captured and gets repeatable and repeatable. We get to see commercials, we get to see types of licenses agreements, how much, what way they're measured, what particular type of contract they might have. And that really allows us then start the journey with them. That's all that does. But also, if we do business, we've captured all that data. And then when we engage with them, because we're skirting close to someone else's intellectual property rights, we have to be really careful. We cannot step on, IBM wrote that software originally, so we have to be cognizant of that, be careful. The customers want to be careful of it too, but we know what rights and obligations the customer has to IBM, but also what rights they have. And that's critical. That gives them the choice. That's the choice. That's how we help them.
Got it. It's an incredible story, because of it's not really just about the maintenance. It's like it's that engine that sits beneath it about what are your rights and what are you allowed to do that you're not, and so just allowing people to understand that they have got other options. And I suppose, the aftermarket is full of that kind of conversation. But I see you and the way you've told your story as one of the people who've made that core to the success of the business and core to the future growth of it as well. There's a kind of story that sits right underneath everything. I find that fascinating. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, and I suppose this is the final question, we're helping a company go to market right now, and their story is that they stop companies wasting money on unproductive IT. So of the $1 billion or $500 million that you spend on IT, you might actually only get productivity from half of that, right? So they look at everything from how many licenses have you bought versus what are you using. But the more important bit is they look at downtime and brownouts and service. So if you're trying to get this cloud service or this Web3 app, or this Web3 service running, but actually there are delays and there are problems or there's downtimes and brownouts and service isn't working, customers aren't getting what they want, and it's taking longer to book something, or, even on Teams, the Teams users might not be able to get what the service that they want. They will tell you exactly where the problem is, what it's costing you to have that problem, where the waste is and who to point the finger at and so on. So it's not what you do, but it's in the similar ballpark of you investing in technology. Are you getting what you want from it? Are you making the most of the investment? And actually, where could you be saving money? What advice would you give to the founder of that business?
That's a good question. So they operate in a similar model. And it's funny you talk about the amount of money that's wasted in technology. I mean, there's research out there from Gartner, I think it is. They talk about the amount of money that companies have, if it's in those hundreds of millions of dollars or pounds, they have about 10% of their overall budget available to do new stuff with. So 90% of the money that they've allocated every year is tied up on lots and lots of different things that they can't unwind, or feel they can't unwind. So we all know there's got to be a lot of savings in there, 100%. My advice, the journey I've taken has worked for me. So if I was to do what I've done to date, I wouldn't change a huge amount. I think you need to get your voice out there. You need to find like-minded organizations. Like we've been really benefited from networking and networking within, cost optimization organizations like that. We work with them insofar as just being part of the same network, being part of the same community. That whole beginning I told you about at the beginning when I used to offer myself up to the software asset management community. The software asset management community embraced what we did, and I became good friends with many people in that industry and still am. And we look out for each other. as best we can. I mean, obviously I'm getting bigger now too. They might be going, okay, now maybe Tomás is getting too big for his boots, but we still have a good relationship and we still work together. And in fact, we would regularly, and we look to try and see, can we help each other still, you know?
Yeah.
So that'd be my advice.
So build your network, get your voice out, get your story out, build your network.
Yeah. Simple as that.
Very good. Before we end, is there anything you want to talk about? Is there anything you want to add?
Well, if anyone's listening who has IBM software or HCL software, please reach out. We'd love to talk to you. You can't stop being a sales guy. One of the things I will say, and what I think we will do, we will, by doing what we do, and the company you just mentioned, the types of companies you talk about, we're changing the technology and industry. We talk about it at Origina, we're changing the software world. We're going to make it a better place for everybody. We're going to make it be a fairer place where technology is back to where it should be. It's an enabler, and it's not going to be something that's going to hold us back. And that's ultimately what we want to achieve.
Love it.
Thanks, Dan.
Tomás, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks for listening to the Programmable World podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe. To find out more about the podcast, our guests and the topics we cover, head over to programmable.world to subscribe to our newsletter or have a look at our company at tellejo.com. That's TOLLEJO.com. Have a good day.